Frame please, frame please, frame please, frame please, tilt down, tilt down, tilt down, tilt further down, tilt down. All right, here, okay. There we go, and that's nice. All right, here. Are we rolling? Well, the first real movie that was made on the West Coast was The Squaw Man, directed by Cecil B. DeMille. He went first to Colorado looking for locations. We couldn't find what he wanted there, so he came south. And he sent a famous letter back to his partners in New York, one of whom was Samuel Goldfish Goldwyn, and said that he had found an ideal place, as he wrote in the letter, in a place called Hollywood. So he wanted their permission to rent a barn, and they were cautious, and they told him that he should rent it a month at a time for $100. What's interesting to me, I have to admit, was that was 1908, and that was the same year that a young woman from Glasgow came out to join her Scots fiancé in Hollywood. And a few years later, they had a baby. They conceived the baby in downtown Los Angeles, but actually went to the East Coast where it was born. I invite you to guess who it was. Well, it does show one thing, that the whole history of the cinema is really in one man's lifetime, mine. So later, a good many years later, I have to admit, when I became the dean of the School of Film Video, the California Institute of the Arts, I'm thinking of people coming from different parts of the world. Andrew, where are you from?
China.
Your family's from China. Marcus, you're?
From Vienna.
From Vienna. Hello?
Reykjavik, Iceland.
And there are others from nearer home. But I think the industry is changing. You're not going to make films the way I did. You're going to have new things to say, which you'll find your own way of saying. So if the industry is going to change, I think I know who's going to change it. Right? So the very best of luck to you, my friends. Okay? Got it. How was it? Let's look at it.
In 1969, the British film director Alexander Sandy McKendrick became founding dean of the School of Film and Video at the newly established California Institute of the Arts, just north of Los Angeles, where he taught filmmaking for nearly 25 years. Today, McKendrick is best known for the work he did at London's Ealing studios in the 1940s and 50s, including the 5 films he directed there: Whisky Galore, The Man in the White Suit, Mandy, The Maggie, and The Ladykillers. In 1957, he went to Hollywood, where he made Sweet Smell of Success, and over the next 10 years directed 3 more features: Sammy Going South, A High Wind in Jamaica, and Don't Make Waves. But for students of cinema, more important than McKendrick's 9 films is his excellence as a writer and a teacher, a role he was to play until his death in 1993 at the age of 81. Designed to guide students through the disciplines McKendrick called dramatic construction and film grammar, his teachings are masterful studies of the 2 primary tasks confronting the film director: how to structure and write the story he wants to tell, and how to use the medium of film in order to tell that story as effectively as possible.
The end of Sandy's career as an active film director came at the end of the 60s. I think up to then he'd been becoming increasingly discouraged and dissatisfied by the amount of time he had to spend making deals rather than making films. He once said, spending 50% of your time making deals and 50% of your time making films, that's acceptable. But when you spend 95% of your time making deals, you're in the wrong business. Ealing had been ideal for him. He'd been allowed to get on with making the films and left it to Michael Balkan to do the deal making.
Ealing was a unique place in many ways in the film world. I worked in many different studios, but mostly at Ealing. And it was quite different from any other studio. The commercialism of the film business passed us by. I mean, we were just there to make films. All the other studios I worked in, I mean, they're just great big factories. We had schedules and we had budget, but the hard realities of commerce, which I came up against after I'd left Ealing, passed me by, and I think that's true of almost everybody else.
The privilege that we had at Ealing was that we started picking a subject. The director picked the subject as much as anybody and worked with the writer right from the beginning. And during that period you were paid.
Solid security, in fact.
That's right, security of employment and the possibility to work from the inception of an idea right through to the realization of it.
But was there a particular sort of atmosphere there, which perhaps came from that, a sort of comfortable atmosphere, a good creative atmosphere?
Yes, I think there was, and it's possible that it was too comfortable. I mean, many of looking back on it, I think probably we were spoiled. We were all behaving as if we were at school, and as if Sir Michael Mick was our schoolmaster. We were always sort of, if you like, sort of questioning his authority, but accepting it at the same time. And we had the umbrella of security, economic security, knowing where your next week's wages were coming from. We weren't paid a great deal, but we had that. We knew we were in secure employment, and we didn't have to fight in the open world, as I think most directors do now.
Very few temperaments and jealousies flying about.
It seemed at the time that there were temperaments and jealousies, but in fact, looking back on it, I now realize there were practically none.
At Ealing, I really felt I was I discovered later that I had been enormously spoiled, because I'm not really awfully interested in the deal-making and the financial aspects of setting up movies. I'm not interested in it because I'm not very good at it. I know it sounds sympathetic to say that you're not really interested in the money-making, but that really is a self-indulgence, because you have to remember that the money-making is what the business is about. The deal is the real product, and the movie is a sort of incidental byproduct of the deal.
I think the reason why I have discovered myself so much happier in what I'm doing now and what I was is that I think over a long period, and particularly after the collapse of the world that I had known, which was in Britain at Ealing Studios, when I came here, I discovered that, in effect, Hollywood was divided into two races of people: those who made movies and those who made deals. And in order to make movies, you had to be a deal maker. And since I had no talent for that, I really had been so spoiled in the past that I had no abilities in this respect. I had insufficient respect for the deal makers. If that's your attitude, and it was my attitude, it was my conditioning, you're in the wrong business. And I realized that and got out of it.
Sandy always tells this story, and this is as close as I've heard him coming to saying why he quit or how he quit, but that he was driving one day several years after having begun as the dean of CalArts Film School, and he was driving and he parked his car, and all of a sudden he felt very agitated, he felt upset, he actually felt pain in his stomach, and he didn't know why, and then he suddenly realized that he was parked outside his old agent's house.
At the end of the 60s, he had two projects, both of which had been treasured projects of his for, 20 years or more. One of them was a film of Ionesco's play Rhinoceros, and the other was a film about Mary, Queen of Scots. And he did some sketches for it, which are absolutely brilliant. Some of the sketches really make you ache with sorrow that this film was never made, because it looks so good, and you can imagine just how brilliant it would have been. All the romantic nonsense taken out of it, and just done as a really tough, hard, downbeat historical film. But then, unfortunately, several films that were on the verge of production went belly up, Mary, Queen of Scots among them, and I think they were within about a month of starting shooting. So at this point, obviously, Sandy was very discouraged, very disillusioned, thoroughly pissed off with the whole movie business. And just about at that moment, he got an offer from the newly founded California Institute of the Arts, which, with some money from the Walt Disney Foundation, was setting up as a multiple art college a little way north of Los Angeles. And they were looking for someone to be dean of the film school.
My wife phoned up from London and said, this man has come all the way from California over to London to meet you, and there you are in California. And I thought at the moment maybe he was somebody who was interested in backing many of these films that never got made. So I went downtown to see him, and we found out that we had various friends in common, and we spent most of the time talking about that. He was just trying to get me to talk. Towards the end of the lunch, he said, no, I think you've got it wrong. I don't want to get into the movie business. I just thought if you would like to get out of it.
He virtually started working right then and there, and I don't think there was, a proper salary had been agreed, and he had no contract with them at that time, but he virtually started teaching then and never left until the day couple of weeks before he died.
I was very bored with not being able to make certain movies that I wanted to make, and I'd had a very interesting career in 30 years of movie making, but I'd done enough of it now not to feel for a moment to regret that somebody offered me the chance to get out of it. And somebody did, and somebody gave me the chance to, instead of making a film, is to make a college, and I was the founding dean of this particular school, where I still work.
It certainly was a blow when Mary Queen of Scots fell through, because there was a subject that he really loved and was serious about. But when the offer came through from Disney, it was just at the right time for him. It's not true to say that he quit making films in a way that sounds as if he was flouncing out in a bad temper. He'd already had 3 careers, one in advertising, one during the war, then during documentaries and feature films, and so he was quite ready to move. In fact, I do remember one day when he'd been sent a script of a television series, I mean quite a good one, but he turned it down, and I said, it seems not at all bad, why did you turn it down? And he said, I worked with the best people under the best circumstances, and I don't see any need to compromise now and go back to doing something which is in fact less interesting than what I was able to do at Ealing.
I know that he turned down offers to make films because he said, my films are my capital, and I don't want to do any films that are not up to what I've done before that dilute, in fact, my capital. And he was right. I mean, his reputation was his capital.
Once he'd committed himself to CalArts, he stayed committed. He did not believe you could teach part-time and make films part-time, except in the case, perhaps, of a very personal documentary which didn't have the same demands on time that a feature would.
One privilege of working with Sandy was being with him after hours in his office to see how his mind worked about his job. I remember specifically being there one day when the phone rang, and he started rolling his eyes at me about who it was. I gathered from what I was overhearing that it was Burt Lancaster. And all I was hearing was Sandy's end of the conversation, which was, well, yes, I did look at it. Well, no, Burt, no, it doesn't work, and I'm not interested. No, on and on and on. And he hung up the phone finally, and he said, forgive me, but he said, what a baby. He said, he won't get it through his head. I don't do that anymore.
It was an extraordinary situation because, as I say, it's one of these things that can only happen in California, where without even a college degree, you're offered a position of a dean. But I was never shy of launching a thing like this, because directing has got some similarities with teaching, and I thought I might enjoy it. So I threw up the movie business lock, stock, and barrel, and cold turkey, walked out.
Did you really feel that that's what you were doing? You didn't sort of think, after a few years I'll go back?
No. I think that's possible for some of the other schools. It's possible to be an academic and to work as an artist and to do to work spare time in other fields, in the other medium, but in movies, no.
It's very lively around here, it really is, and I'm trying to solve tomorrow's problem, and I wake up every morning full of the excitement of the dilemmas and frustrations of what I'm doing now. I will take it as it comes along. It's very exciting.
CalArts was seen as an avant-garde institution. The emphasis in the film program was on more experimental film. The school was founded in the late 60s, and it reflected sort of the zeitgeist at that time. There were a lot of drugs, there was a lot of nudity, sort of the whole post-hippie era.
Everybody was an artist. You were either a beginning artist or an experienced artist, but nobody was a professor or a student. All of the faculty of CalArts were expected to be continuing working artists rather than, as often happens in the university, kind of retired or failed. and the whole idea of those who can't teach, was not what we were aspiring to. We were aspiring to having working artists all throughout CalArts, and including the film school, who would do their work and would take leaves to go off and do their work and come back refreshed and with war stories.
I was really surprised the way the film school worked, because it wasn't treated in an academic way. The faculty had been chosen because of what they had accomplished. We had a documentarian, We had a personal filmmaker, we had a screenwriter, we had a guy who had sort of done, experimental Stan Brakhage kind of films. We had an animator, and we had Sandy teaching drama. So there was every kind of cinema, the sort of everything from kind of painterly arty type cinema to Hollywood movie type cinema.
The California Institute of the Arts was, I think, at the time, the only institute of higher education, further education, devoted solely to the performing arts. It didn't have an English department or a history department. It just had film and video, art, photography, theatre and dance.
There was a strong element of experimental filmmaking at CalArts, and Sandy never really had a lot of time for experimental filmmaking. He once described it as abdicating your responsibility to the story. For him, to give your life over to nothing but experimental filmmaking was taking a soft option, because an experimental film doesn't have to tell a story, and indeed a lot of experimental filmmakers rather despise the idea of telling a story. Sandy never despised the story.
He came in his British black, turtleneck and his, black pants and, didn't wear tie-dye and, didn't wear sunglasses coming into the room. He was never stoned. He was never drunk. He was never plastered while teaching. And many students didn't appreciate it. There was a narrative group who hung around Sandy, the storytellers. This was a bad thing.
He had a reputation for being conservative at CalArts just because, you couldn't just staple something to a board and film it and turn the lights on and off and say, hey, look, this is my film, unless you could explain the purpose of it and the why of it. So, that at CalArts was conservative, I think believing you should stay clothed at graduation was conservative for CalArts.
The filmmaker kind of has to decide what their social function is. If they're a storyteller, well, the idea is to convey the story. And if you create a piece of experimental artwork that really doesn't speak the language that most people understand, it could be stimulating to a few people. But is it really going to reach out and fulfill the traditional storyteller function, which is to awaken in the broader society some sense of who it is, what it is, who it is? And so I think that's what Sandy was talking about. He, in other words, I think, I'm putting words in his mouth a little bit, but I think he would have said this, is that yeah, it's sort of easier to go and point a camera at something and call it art than it is to actually learn the discipline of creating a world in a dramatic movie. It's harder. So a lot of people just sort of don't want to do the hard work, aren't interested in that, so they just sort of slap some paint on the canvas, as it were, and call it Pollock. And in a movie, that may or may not really hold the audience's attention.
Experimental film and experimental video, at least at CalArts, was notably vague. Generally, it was very strong on images and mood and emotion. But as far as coming to any conclusions or anything, it was noticeably vague. And Sandy always said he thought that one of the reasons that so much experimental filmmaking was vague, and now deliberately made so, to Sandy's way of thinking, was that they didn't really have anything to say. And you hid it through a lot of rather obscure images and so forth. Now, this infuriated the experimental faculty, which were about 3/4 of the faculty. And so Sandy was always at loggerheads with them about that. They didn't feel that they were being vague at all. He thought the better experimental work that he saw definitely had something to say, conveyed a feeling, if not through dramatic narrative, if not through a scene with dialogue and all of that, certainly through emotion. And I found that Sandy greatly appreciated some experimental art. In fact, he ranked it way up here. And it's just that a great deal of it didn't meet that bar.
There were other people who were Sandy's intellectual equal in the school with different opinions in other departments. There was a Korean conceptual video artist named Namjoon Paik who Sandy quite liked and who liked Sandy. They disagreed about everything. and their intellectual battles were huge. And while going to film school, with Sandy as my mentor, I was also working as an assistant for Nam June Paik, so to earn a little money so I could pay the rent, you know. And so I'm caught between these two hilarious worlds. Nam June Paik has a boa constrictor in a pillowcase and is programming a video synthesizer with help from Don Buchla to the movement of the snake. And Sandy is telling me, on the other hand, this is shallow, go deeper. This is shallow, go deeper. You don't understand it yet. Get your act together. Think this through. Push the dramatic edge. And so somewhere between the snake in the bag and the library lay this kind of really fecund, challenging environment, and Sandy loved it.
Guy's got one of these super high-speed cameras that shoots 1,000 frames a second or whatever, you know, and runs through a 1,000-foot load of 16 millimeter in 10 seconds or something like that. And they got a rabbit, and they put a gun to its head. They turned on the camera, and they shot the rabbit in the head. So the entire, 10 minutes, you're watching this excruciatingly slow-motion representation of a rabbit being shot in the head. And, of course, that was very controversial, and at some point art is supposed to be, and it is an art school after all. But I think the kind of movie making that fascinated Sandy most was taking people to some other place, transporting them into the world of other characters.
He was seen as sort of a little island of tradition in the midst of all this great exploration. But the great question, to me, was that he asked of students one day, or maybe it came out at a faculty meeting when there was this discussion and debate of what do we teach and how much freedom do we give students. And somebody used the word that we were a school about the avant-garde, and Sandy was when Sandy phrased that question is, an avant of what?